Thank you for joining me for day 351 of the Daily Bread Bible Study for Wednesday, December 16th, 2020, focusing on the book of Hebrews. Now, as we begin in Hebrews, we remember that there is no stated author here, so we're not exactly sure who wrote it. It's attributed by tradition to the Apostle Paul. Now, there are many references to Jesus here as a priest of the order of Melchizedek, with the name appearing 8 times in the book of Hebrews alone, which is the majority of the time this name appears in the Bible. So who was Melchizedek? Melchizedek was the king of Salem who encountered a guy named Abram before his name was changed to Abraham. This was in chapter 14 of Genesis, and he was a priest of the God Most High. He blessed Abram and really indicated that God favors Abram. And this was before any of the law was given, any of the instruction around circumcision that was made. This was a blessing apart from the law of Moses and the covenant of circumcision. And so for the usage here in Hebrews, it's stating that God can bless people outside of the covenant of circumcision and the law of Moses. So addressing the challenge here in the book of Hebrews, it speaks of, instead of the Israelites, it speaks of Hebrews, right? A name mentioning the people who were, the first to receive the acts of God. And this Hebrews as well speaks of those who have difficulty seeing God act, both in Abraham's time and Moses' time, but also, namely, in Jesus' day and time, specifically the Jews of his day and time who were very zealous for the law of Moses. So those are some brief themes. Let's dive into Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the worlds. Now, the argument begins with the importance of having Jesus as God's Son, the one with authority to judge and rule, as it says in verse 8. But of the Son, he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the righteous scepter is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions." Moving into Hebrews chapter 2, this authority remains with Jesus even while he is in human form, as a reminder that humanity has been given some privilege already by God, as it says in Hebrews 2, verse 6. But someone has testified somewhere, "What are human beings that you are mindful of them, or mortals that you care for them?" This, again, in the book of Hebrews is full of many references to the Old Testament, trying to persuade and convince individuals that Jesus has his ministry and what God is doing through Jesus is applicable even for those who are very zealous for the law. So this reference is from Psalm chapter 8. It's a psalm of creation, talking about the wonder of creation and God's works of God, and the works of God's hands in creation. So the idea is that human beings are somehow beloved by God, and this is connected with Jesus, who became human. So with all this power and authority given, Jesus could have used it for his own self-service, but instead, in humble service, even experienced suffering. And this service of Jesus was overcoming death and being resurrected. This is not to be overlooked in Hebrews 2, verse 9. By the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. It was fitting that God, for whom, through whom all things exist, and bringing many children to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through sufferings. So the idea is that through the sufferings, Jesus can connect with us, relate with us, be able to be with us present in the midst of the hardest times in our lives. Just as the readers are suffering the persecution or from persecutions in their day and time, for those who were zealous for the law, just a reminder, the Apostle Paul was a Pharisee in good standing, sent to persecute and the church in Damascus. And that's when he had his encounter of Jesus, shortly after he stoned Stephen, the deacon, to death. So all of these persecutions were happening in the church among believers. And these sufferings of Jesus are a helpful reminder that Jesus became vulnerable to the same wounds we will experience. So in Hebrews 3, the suffering servant functions not only as a king and as a son, but also as a high priest who mediates the atonement of the people. In Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1, consider that Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was, quote, faithful to all in God's house. Now, Jesus' work is contrasted to Moses, saying that Jesus deserves more renown than Moses did. Now, the imagery continues that God built the structure Moses upheld, namely a nation who follows the way of the law. Yet Jesus was appointed as a mediator over this structure of the law. The atonement Jesus offers through the sacrifice of himself creates a new relationship with the law, one that many zealous for the law in his day and time reject. This is why references to being, quote, hard of heart are made, keeping people from entering into God's, quote, rest. In chapter 4, the writer continues to discuss this rest, which is based upon faith. Now, the argument is that this rest is more than making it to the, quote, promised land, either metaphorically or symbolically, but is a deeper rest promised by faith in God. This rest involves letting go of the pursuit of labors, functioning as a Sabbath rest with God. So this pursuit of labors would be kind of the negative side of looking at the law, and the way from the perspective of Hebrews, saying that the law is about fulfilling all of these works and pursuing all of these labors, so that way you might be justified before God. Now, it is instead through a justification through Jesus and the gift of Jesus' atoning sacrifice in himself, which mediates this life and salvation with God. So that's from the perspective of Hebrews. Now, again, all this is enacted through Jesus, the one who atones our sins through faith, as a high priest did under the sacrificial model instituted by Moses. So Jesus fulfills the law here in all the sacrifices that are required to make atonement. We will discuss more about this theology next time as we go into Hebrews again for the next couple of days.